I want to start with greetings. And I'm going to first go around the country to try and greet everybody. So I'll start here in the Western Cape. Molweni no, okay? Goedemiddag allemaal. Good afternoon, everybody.
Afternoon.
Sanbonani.
Sanbona.
Dumelang.
Avshe.
Legai.
Hitenga.
Auksheni. Da. Jambo Africa. Haidai. Assalamu alaikum. So I try to greet as many people as possible. And sometimes I just put on this picture so that I can relax. But it's actually a picture that I use when I have to explain a favorite way in which men emotionally regulate from what I'm learning, from working with men quite closely and intimately. Because in 2019, I published, an editorial was published in which I then claimed that men are emotionally competent, and I then list some of the reasons why I say that. But in this presentation today, I'm hoping for a much broader and a critical conversation, like my colleague was saying, Tandile, and so that we can talk about men and healing. I will start by putting violence in its proper time and place, because culture actually means time and place, right? Everything happens inside time and place. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start by putting violence in its time and place. And when you start putting violence in its time and place, you're more likely to get to a more holistic understanding of gender-based violence, right? So that's the first thing that I'm going to do, so that the GBV agenda can be escalated rather than the current status quo where there's lots of, sound bites about gender-based violence. As the statistics go up and it gets more horrific in its expression. And I do the same then with gender. I South Africanize gender. In other words, I bring gender closer to humanness. You can't be whatever gender you choose to be without being human first. So I do that, the same thing with that. And so that we can then ask, what is a man? Who is a man? And who is a black man? And then next, I tackle the definition of healing so that we can then get a better grasp as to what do I mean and what do I do with men when I say doing healing with boys and men? Yeah. But what I want to start with today is I want to start with giving a definition of what I mean by foundational violence. So when I say foundational violence, for me, I'm talking about a form of a slow poison genocide. It's when you're strangling and squeezing the life out of a group of people, choking out their ability to meet their basic needs, like loving themselves, having families, being able to move around, raising children, or generating an income. That's what I mean. So you're squeezing the life out of them. And then the other important aspect of foundational violence is that you tear at the very fabric of a society in a way that will be present for the next several generations. So foundational violence is something, it happens today, but 3 generations later, you are still seeing the impact. So what I will do is I'm only going to scratch the surface. I'm going to give you 3 examples of foundational violence. So let's start with the first one. And you may wonder, what on earth does Trevor Noah have to do with foundational violence? A happy man, right? So a shortage of labor has been a thorny issue since the first settlers arrived in South Africa. So we've had centuries old of labor issues. What we're seeing playing out today happened right at the start, labor shortage. Now, Trevor Noah is often at pains to distinguish himself from colored people. He says, I'm colored by complexion, but not by culture. And I agree with him, all right? He's right. But there's a very important commonality between Trevor and colored people that he often misses. And that is that just as the infant Trevor Noah sucked at the breast of a black woman, a Xhosa woman more specifically, the first colored babies were nursed in black kraals. And so we often forget, that the mother of colored people was black women. So just like Trevor Noah sucked on the breast of a black woman, so was this first colored babies. Now, when it comes to children born outside of wedlock, we are used to the narratives of, okay, the guy at the back, he's the father, he pays damages. We even have names for paying damages in our local traditions. Or he rejects or he denies paternity, or worse still, sometimes the identity of the father is sort of, mired in mystique and mystery. We don't know who the father is. And this is where it gets interesting, because I was doing South African history at Unisa, and I had to write an assignment on slavery in the Western Cape. And I learned that some farmers had sex, raped, or just had their way with indigenous women with the sole purpose of making slave babies. So I was traumatized as I tried to wrap my head around that level of calculatedness of solving your labor problems by making little slaves. So for me, that's what trauma is. It's a narrative that your brain is struggling to wrap its head around, okay? And so the first colored babies were not even made with babies in mind, thank you, all right? They were never meant to be humans, all right? And I'll return to the idea of humans. But now I want to fast forward to today, because I said foundational violence has intergenerational consequences. You have colored men, less than 10% of the general population, probably about 80% of the prison population. That is among, like I said, I'm just going to scratch the surface. Now I want to, the second foundational violence that I want to speak to concerns the stolen land. What most people do not realize, that when thousands of black people were driven off their lands in 1913, the confiscation of black lands actually continued right into the 1980s and probably even beyond. All right, now you must appreciate then, for indigenous people across the world, I'm talking about the global south, wherever you find indigenous people, whether they're Mexicans, Mayans, Incas in South America, or whether we're looking at the Buddhists and the Hindus, the Taoists, the Chinese on the Far East, or for us here on the continent and the Middle East, so whether we call ourselves Africans or Arabs, indigenous people seamlessly integrate the spiritual with the material. That's not a conflict for indigenous people, what academics discuss endlessly about whether there's a God or not. Indigenous people seamlessly integrate. So when you take the land, you are disrupting several layers of the cultural and the spiritual practices. Fast forward to today, you find that marriage rates in the Black community has plummeted dramatically. Most children are born outside of wedlock in the South African context. Now, my last example that I want to use concerns the systematic emasculation of Black men by white men, and specifically the efforts that were made to interfere with Black male ability to earn a decent wage. Now, we are all familiar with the migrant labor system causing severe strain. It was usual for families to see their father once a year. So you can imagine, as they went into those hostels, the loss of their culture, the immorality that started to creep in. So you then again have the severe disruptions of the Black families. Coupled with that, white men could not compete with Black men in the labor market. In other words, Black men were outperforming white men at the time. And so what then happened is that they brought in the job color bar. And so the job color bar then effectively excluded Black men from the labor market. Now, fast forward to today. according to a 22 research by Dr. Hannah Dawson from WITS, most low-wage jobs are dangerous, demeaning, and also fail to provide a decent living wage. So you find that a lot of Black men are eking out an existence on low-paying jobs. So not earning enough to pay damages, which means you haven't paid damage, you don't get access to your child, okay? So a man that is not able to pay damages, according to, you can correct me, cultural norms, right? He's not able to have access. Because especially in our indigenous community, fatherhood is not biological. Fatherhood is social, constructed, all right? So I'm just giving you one example of the current impact of that kind of violence that is still there. So some scholars talk about the intractable cycles of poverty. We know that thousands of people face material, what do you call it, food insecurity every day in South Africa. We have evidence of children with stunted growth, their brains not able to grow, because we also had evidence of both women and men suffering from depression because of their inability to actually feed their children. Fathers often, my colleague at UCT, she did the research with men who stand on the side of the road. You see those men always at every corner trying to find a peace job. A lot of those, she interviewed them, and a lot of them unable to support their children because there's no money even for transport to get to the children. If you don't want to believe me, you can just go and look at the demographics of those guys, those hitmen who was caught, who shot the whistleblower, Ms. Dio Karan, right? You just go and look at who those men are. All Black men. At what job they do. Look at who they are. What I'm trying to bring to you is a different way in which we can see how violence are constantly in our midst.
Sorry, I just want to go back a bit. You said that Black men outperformed white men, like colonial times. Was that like a social thing? Was it genetic, or what was the reason why they were outperforming them, and why we're sitting with this issue now of sort of white men are up there, Black men are down here, except for apartheid now, obviously. But why did they outperform them?
Well, I think, I don't think, I think I'm going to need to have a session on that, because I think you need to go back to pre-colonial times where I can best say it in Afrikaans, where they used to say, Afrikaner, white men particularly, hulle het gekrepeer van die ellende. So you have to go back to your own history to understand how badly and poorly Afrikaners were performing, so that you can understand that when it comes to the Oscars of affirmative action, apartheid is right up there. Excellent. And I think if we could do affirmative action today as Black people, the way Afrikaners did it, we wouldn't be sitting with the problems that we're sitting. Okay, so thank you. I think that's a very, very good question. Okay, so next slide. So what I was doing now was to bring foundational violence together with gender-based violence, because Chimamanda Adichie, the celebrated Nigerian author and storyteller, she says, if you tell only part of the story, you are actually lying. All right. So gender-based violence makes sense in the context of foundational violence. Failure then to properly situate gender-based violence leads to oversimplified understandings of gender-based violence. Okay. And it also leads to misdiagnosis. So you see then, so all this work that is doing on gender-based violence, and you don't see the drop in the statistics, right? So because gender-based violence, just like addictions, child abuse, corruption, alcohol abuse, all of those things are through the roof in South Africa. You can go check the literature. Right? And it usually, what you can also see, if you take a global perspective across the world, you will find in the aftermath of foundational violence, go to those indigenous people in America, you see the alcoholism, they're all beating their wives. you know, you will see that what they call horizontal violence will follow in the wake of what we call vertical violence, state-sponsored violence. Okay, so and you can't separate it because it means you're being selective in terms of what you're calling violence, and it means that you are practicing apartheid because you are separating things. Because that's what apartheid is. So those people who are nostalgic about apartheid, I just want to say it's never gone away. All right, it's right here with us in the way we're thinking. So then we also then need to heed the words of your own Professor Kupano Ratele. Yeah, right? So I'll put a picture in case some of you don't know who he is. And he writes about the paradoxes of black male violence. And he says that black men are both the drivers and the victims of violence. They appear fearless while they are extremely vulnerable to a range of social ills. Okay, now Professor Ratele probably knows more than most people about male violence. He certainly knows more than what I do. Yet he actually comes with a perspective of acknowledging male vulnerability. That's why, you know, his writing is important. Because if you must know the number of black men that dies at the hands of other black men every day in society, the numbers are astounding, all right? And it's actually like that globally. You have that the number of men who kill other men is extremely high. Do we call that gender-based violence? That's a rhetorical question, right? But the numbers are there, the evidence is there that black men killing other black men is very high. The Optimus study that was out recently, earlier in this year, showed that slightly more boys reported that they are subject to sexual abuse than girls. So the rates of violence and victimization, according to, so Professor Ratele is completely correct in his perspective that actually the rate at which men are victimized is very, very high. So there's a paradox. So then this brings me then, just like I did with violence and with gender-based violence, I bring things into its time and place. We do the same now for gender. Right? So just like I bring violence, foundational violence, state-sponsored violence together with gender-based violence, I bring gender together with humanness. Because gender is a subcategory of being human. Gender is culturally constructed. What Raymond Canal refers to as different gender regimes. So different people would do different things. Oyawumi, Oyaronki Oyawumi, the Nigerian author, right? You cannot find gender outside of the social cultural, okay? So you have to situate gender. You can't just talk about a man or queer, and you see how this is just thrown around, right? You have to situate what that community calls queer or what that community, you can't talk of something gender outside of its location, of its situatedness. So in the colonial gender regime then, the term woman does not include me as a black woman, right? Because according to their regimes of what is regarded as a human, I am not regarded as a human, as a black woman, right? In terms of the colonial way of defining what does it mean to be human? To be separate, it's to be autonomous, it's all sorts of things that they define what makes me human, and I do not meet the criteria, so hence I can't be. But in the African context, I can say, because from an African perspective, in the way, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that just now, because the African understanding of being human is actually it's a values construct. It's got nothing to do with the color, okay? So it's a values construct. It's seeing yourself that you make me human. I am human because of you. And the minute there's a relationship between me and her, There's ethics. She must be safe with me. There must be trust. There must be openness. That is why we say an African understanding of being human is about values. And so it just tells you something about the levels of corruption. What has happened? Okay. And then this is the second issue that then arises. There is this assumption of a universal category called woman. I'm like, really? How? Where did you draw that line? That there's a universal category called woman. On what basis is there a universal category? Because in terms of my paradigm, an African paradigm, is that I belong to every single rapist, racist, every single murderer, every single intellectually challenged person falls under the category of being human. And so every plant, every animal, every river, part of the same, entangled. We've discovered fluidity of late, but it's an old African perspective, right? That we are fluid entanglements. Now, what I want to say is the next one is that so much of manhood is tied up with women. This is this author. Okay? And I had to also make sense of my own presence as a woman amongst men, because my presence as a woman is transgressive according to my own culture and according to African tradition. What are you doing there? You don't belong there, right? But so I had to make sense of my presence. But then I realized, but all over the world, who receives babies, including boy babies? Who received them? Who received you as a man when you were born? Who received you all over the world? It is a woman who received the first baby. So as she gazes in the eyes of a newborn baby, she recognizes his difference from her. So women are the first affirmers of manhood, right? So the first validators of masculinity as women. What I also want to say then is that I collaborate in this work that I do with women, with men. I will not be able to do this work effectively. Women collaborate with me all the time for this work with men. And also there are women who support me, and there are women who are invested in this work, because women benefit from the work that I do with men. And the literature makes it clear. Women throughout their lives are key validators of manhood. They are not on the sides when it comes to men, right? So this brings me to the next one, to the issue of healing. Given all of what I'm saying then, what is healing? I'm going to start with what healing is not. Healing is not charity. I'm not Mother Teresa. I am not doing welfare work, not doing good, okay? And some of you maybe who's in psychology or social work know that much of your diagnosing and fixing people is forms of violence. Because healing requires, all healing comes from a relationship. So whether you're a Sangoma or whether you're a psychiatrist, that healing, however you define it, you first have to come together with a person, right? So in other words, healing then requires that you form a circle. That's what relationship is about. It's about bonding. And so, and understanding requires empathy. But what is empathy? It requires that you deal with your arrogance so that you can be empathic. So empathy is an act of courage. Because what stops us from having empathy with men? What is it? Ideology? Yeah? What stops us? Because when I form an engagement with a person sitting opposite me, I understand I'm looking for his inner healer, because I can't fix him. I am dependent on his inner healer emerging. And I'm hoping that I'm creating a safe space enough so that his inner healer can emerge. He's doing the healing. I can't. Sure? Okay. All right. So the second thing that I want to say about healing then is healing is deeply unconscious. Relationships happen at the unconscious level. So when I walk into Brandvlei male prison, or Poolsmoor, and I interact with a group of prisoners. Before I had sat down, they have already sussed me out. They know whether I can be trusted. They know whether they're going to cut me up into small pieces or whether I'm safe enough. I should live with the benefit, all right? Because healing does not happen here at our executive brain. Healing, and relationships form from the back, our survival brain, and also deep inside our emotional brain. Because forming connections is primal. It's not an intellectual thing, right? So that's what I just want to say about healing, so that I can get to the question that I asked, and who is a man and who is a black man? And I'm back with Professor Atele, and he quotes Steve Biko. What I want to get into is just that term spirit there that is used by Biko. So, and I want to now go into this, what I refer to as a mother self. Now remember, just like cultures have regimes of gender, cultures also have regimes of what it means to be human. So I go to our own indigenous regime of what it means to be human. I come to, that's why I call it the mother self, as in mother tongue, because the vast majority of South Africans see themselves in this way, including the vast majority of the what do we call it? The South, the global South. Yeah? So you go to the Japanese, the Chinese, the whole Southeast Asia, the Buddhists, the Hindus, yeah, on this continent, right? We know even that the mother of the Arabs was a black woman, was a black slave woman, right? So it brings me then to the Ubuntu construct of humanity, the mother self. And this way of seeing, like indigenous people used to see themselves as literally as umoya, meaning literally women. So they saw themselves then as this shifting, moving, dynamic spirit. And it's almost like what the new physics are describing, that human beings are this antennae, and we are then open to all the fields in the cosmos in terms of being open to the knowledge and the exchange, right, with the cosmos. And so the new physics improved that the ancient Africans were spot on actually in the way they defined that at the core that you are wind, that you are spirit, because, and this I get from physics, right? So a human being is made up of about like trillions of cells, and each cell operates like a little a generator, and they can now image the energy that you give off. In fact, you don't even have to put this thing that measures your electromagnetic forces of the heart, because it's so strong. You don't even have to put the thing on your skin. It throws it out up to 5 meters almost from you. All right. So you're made up of all these trillions of cells, and then every cell is then made up of trillions of atoms. And now they can, the new physics can prove that an atom is 99.9999% space. So in other words, the ancient Africans were right, that we are wind, because at the atomic level now they can prove that that it's space. We are inside of ourselves, we are space, right? Now, why is this moving, dynamic spirituality so important? So when I then meet with men individually or in groups, we then have this. So I make this. This is this, right? But it's just more. It's more like user friendly. So when I then work with men, in fact, even I was in Bloemfontein now, doing training with a psychologist there, and some of the white Afrikaans psychologists, I translated umoya into Afrikaans so that they can relate, because remember, this is the beauty for me of the African perspective. It has space for everybody. And so I said, umoya means so wyd soos die Here se genade. Making sense? Okay? So that it opens up the narrow spirituality of religion so that you can understand spirituality as connection. That's the form of spirituality that we're talking about from an indigenous perspective. So when I start with people, even when I do training, I don't start with the pornography and the depression, you know, and the chaos in the relationships. I don't start there. I start with Ongubani. Visa Masakantas J. Right? Who are you? Because I first need to bring an understanding of the whole you. Why? Because it brings perspective. So that, and I want you to look here, in my own tradition, this is called the animal and the beauty, and that's why I have to use sometimes the indigenous terms. In Xhosa, where the sun doesn't shine. Wow. That's where Jung probably got the idea of the shadow from. Right? Did he reference? Okay, so what I want you to understand, whether it's the pornography, whether it's, you know, sometimes in the prisons, the guys want to confess, you know. It just comes to them, and I want to, at that point, I want to confess how many murders or what I did, whatever. It's all there. So in other words, whatever you did is only there. The rest of you is still open to all the fields in the universe. We confuse the shadow with the whole person. And so when I do this, immediately, that is why I'm able to work comfortably with men. Because I understand. Or when I've had several women, for example, married, confess they've had sex with someone other than the husband. Oh, the shame, especially when they look like this, okay? The shame, okay? She's had sex with someone else. Where is that? The fornication or the fact that she's, whatever she's done is here. The rest of her is still open to the same, so wyd soos die Here se genade. Still, you know, it's still, she's included in the fold of what it means to be human. So I'm going to stop here just so that I can start closing up. I think I just want to, with this one, I still just want to add with the TRC. So you saw what Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when those apartheid criminals appeared in front of him, he was able to converse and have a conversation because he understood that whatever humans do, you know, everybody's judging, but it's here only, not the whole person. Yeah. So it brings a sense of, so that even if somebody has erred from an African perspective, you're always open to transform to a new perspective, right? To seeing myself differently, to go through forgiveness and reparations, not just forgiveness, reparations, all right? So let me, so I just want to, this is just the picture, this is the next one, because I'm going to start closing now. So normally we do this type of, you know, when I was the satus, and there's a lot more movement, you know, in the room. And we do this type of activity so that we break all these divisions and apartheid that we bring in around the way we speak about men and women. So that we can begin to see ourselves, I'm invested in masculinity. I rely on so many men in my life. So not all of us also have all of those type of, we are not minimizing the suffering. But remember, I'm a healer, so I have to retain perspective. I have to allow, so wyd soos die Here se genade, that everybody is still under the mercy. All right? So, this is now the last one. Okay. So, in conclusion, then, I want to say that I started this presentation by expanding the definition of violence so that we do not look for problems inside people, but we will see then that both the problem and the solution is at the interface of the environment of the person. So please ask psychologists that they need to learn about humanities so that they can understand a life outside of pathology. Narrow personal pathology, right? There's a big world beyond that. So, because the splitting and the separation, this apartheid, is creating the violence of keeping things apart. Like Chimamanda says, we must tell the whole story. I did the same with gender. I brought gender together with what it means to be human. So that when I work with a man, then we work at the human level. And so he starts to, repair, and he can grieve for what was done to him as a child. And so you can see there's a shift. He's able to be more compassionate to himself, because men are extremely, extremely violent to themselves. And so I have to hold it so that the man can find forgiveness for himself. And then when he starts to shift at human level, his understanding of what his manhood means. I don't work with manhood. I don't. All that I do is I keep women out, because men are more able to go into the vulnerability in the absence of women. Because the minute there's women, what comes into place is the scripts that men have to follow, for women. So when I remove women, and I remove those scripts, but the men work on themselves, and then the understanding of their manhood changes. Healing is about bringing together that which was apartheid. Okay? The most important part of healing is to embrace who we really are, and not these Western liberal feminist projections of what we think we are. Right? So I want to close then by saying that the most powerful healing is the truth of who we really are. Thank you.